in Vermont, 80% forested. Most of our ag land is due to dairy, and most of our ag sales are dairy. So we're strongly dairy in the sense of agriculture. Steady trend, like a lot of places, fewer dairy farms, slightly fewer cows. The new trend of more processors. Here's our kind of our herd size distribution. It's and the amount of digested manure in Vermont. So the green is the manure from that herd number that's going through a digester. About 10% of our manure is going through a digester right now. Agricultural greenhouse gas in Vermont, and I'm not counting anything to do with transportation here. I think I just need to step away and cough every few seconds. This cough is great. It's like an actual better cough than I've had in a while. Anyhow, most of our agricultural greenhouse gas in Vermont is from ruminants. It's 6% of our greenhouse gas is this eructation and flatus. That's the actual front and rear is the common term. So 2% of our greenhouse gas from soils, as Jennifer said, nitrous oxide, and 2% from manure emissions. So how do you mitigate these things? Well, it seems like what's happening in dairy farm viability is kind of sustainable intensification, I guess I'd call it. Or, the other model, and maybe that's part of what this fellow was talking about organic, is like lower inputs and outputs and still adequate net revenue, right? Do you want to just keep going after yield per acre and hire everything per everything because there's a diminishing return a lot of the time? So, these are the kinds of things I think about in the business development realm are what can you do? Raw milk, organic, some of these other things. And I think stepping back, America's cheap food system, and if you've ever seen the movie King Corn, Earl Butz, the former Secretary of Agriculture, said, we won. We created cheap food. This is the vast victory from when he grew up in the 1920s, farming, hungry, growing up on a farm, working his ass off and being hungry, crazy. So, that's the quandary we're in, and it affects everything we do. I guess maybe I can't speak for you, but it certainly affects everything I do. So this is a device to measure eructation and flatus from cows, and it is certainly measurable what you're doing there, and you could change the feed ratio on a cow to get her to emit differently. And there's trade-offs though. You tweak the diet to emit less methane, and what do you get? Well, you get higher production per greenhouse gas, but you're probably maybe less grass-based, so you can get higher milk per greenhouse gas emission. Maybe you have, there's these differences could affect what the milk is looking like to change the feed, and maybe there's more volatile solids in the manure. Look at the factors affecting enteric methane production. It's feed, it's breed, it's all kinds of stuff. So I think that's an interesting area of investigation, and now there's a way to measure the enteric emissions, and that's kind of interesting just from a data and gathering information point of view, because it is the biggest part of the agricultural emissions. Just briefly on digesters, Jennifer really talked about it. The mitigation here is just burning the darn methane and turning it into carbon dioxide. The bonus mitigation is if you make electricity or use the heat. Basic schematic of a digester according to EPA, USDA, and American Biogas Council. You probably know what these are. This is in a below ground type digester based on sort of what a concrete foundation under a building would look like. It's a U-shaped flow here. Typical more in Europe would be tanks above ground, and often two tanks, a hydrolysis pre-treatment tank, and then a main tank. What I'm looking at is emerging technologies of small digesters. There's 4 or 5 different companies, and hoping that some of this stuff can pop. And again, from my perspective, it's about farm viability. What can be done that can help the farmer while mitigating greenhouse gas and just adding to Vermont's energy system. So these are some small digesters. Again, this one on the left is one that's looking to make an impact in the United States. The others are less far along in the United States. It's called the bioelectric. There's about 120, 30 systems in Netherlands, Belgium. So that's intriguing. Here's a couple more. The one down at the bottom right, there's about 3,500 of these in Mexico, Guatemala, Central America, now into Africa. Typical bag system, very effective, targeted to the 50 to 150 cows, what they call in the developing world productive agriculture, i.e. not subsistence. Just a little bit about mitigation, adaptation, digesters. Jennifer was talking about kind of adaptation, mitigation maybe as part of that. So I say, there's a lot of hype on digesters, and I say digesters tend to enable practices that improve water quality. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it kind of boils down to, in a way, people thinking, wow, this manure really has value. And now that it's come out of my digester, I can separate the solids pretty easily, and now I've got a thin slurry, and I like to dragline a thin slurry or inject a thin slurry, and there's some phosphorus that's staying in the solids, so now the ratio in our phosphorus limited land base of phosphorus to nitrogen is better on the slurry that you're injecting out of the digester. So I do see this. There's just more emphasis placed on water quality by people who operate a digester. And now moving to sequestration in soils. So I just want to talk about the sort of international US and Vermont discussion on this and touch on biochar. Internationally, this past round in Paris, they had the 4 per 1,000 initiative. Pretty simple concept that if you increase soil carbon by 4%, 0.4% per year, 4 per 1,000, that is enough to offset all the CO2 emissions. So 4% per year increase in soil carbon is enough to offset all the annual emissions, annual to annual comparison. So there's increasing recognition, I would say, of soil dynamics and the potential for sequestration. EPA inventory is starting to account for sequestration, there's more of a popular understanding, I think. There's this book, Drawdown. Paul Hawkins, kind of a famous author, and it ranks strategies and talks about the different drawdown strategies to pull carbon out of the air. In Vermont, we have the Vermont Climate Action Commission that's active right now. It was executive order of our governor aiming for legislation-ready recommendations. And there's many tracks. A lot of people are pretty intent on transportation or taxes or grid modernization, but there is one track on ag and forestry sequestration. And it's interesting, we're sort of thinking about it as sequestration, but you gotta remember these other things too. And we cannot have this sequestration and then directly also be increasing emissions from nitrous oxide in the soil. So that doesn't work. You gotta be careful. It's gotta be some way of having sequestration in soils that's permanent. And from my perspective, it certainly isn't gonna happen unless it's profitable in some form or another. Or, what are we gonna do? Regulate that you have to increase soil carbon? I don't think that's the way it's gonna work. There's funding for stuff now, but somehow it all has to add up. And I think, there's an exercise here to present this in acceptable terms. How do we talk about it? So, soil sequestration, solutions to these questions. I guess I feel like, all that nitrous oxide stuff, I'm just gonna wave my hands and say, look, I'm a business development person. You people figure that out. And I'm learning more about it, but it's clearly an issue, and it has to be part of the equation here. Permanence, I admit that it's an issue, and we got to deal with it. And I think there's ways to borrow and adopt. I shouldn't have said adapt. Well, maybe adapt as well. Tools and rules from forestry. They're further along in this than we are in ag, and they have stuff like annuitizing, penalizing, putting stuff in trust, whatever. I don't care whatever needs to happen to make this permanent. And profitability, and got to talk about that. How do we do this? Maybe it's just talking about it as soil health and soil retention. Can we get credits? Where's the profitability in soil carbon credits? Well, not yet, or maybe I just haven't heard about it. And is it enough to make it even worth, screwing around with the paperwork? And how we talk about it, this is a real eye-opener, this piece of equipment. And I don't know how many people have seen this thing. Yeah, you're all drinking the non-polluted water. So great piece of equipment, opened my eyes, opens a lot of people's eyes. A lot of people say, that's my farm in that jar. That's my farm in that right-hand jar. I don't want to see that. So they get hip to it. And I think, just want to talk about biochar in terms of like a sequestration strategy. It's, a lot of hype about it. Basically it's in between charcoal and an activated carbon. And it solves the permanence issue as far as I can tell. It fits into this 4 per 1,000 initiative. It's certainly a powerful kind of a drawdown strategy. Plus you have a heat byproduct that you could use. The problem with it is it solves too many problems. It's got a lot of hype. And there's too many usages and claims for it, and there's no standards and not very much data about how it works. So what I think is really needed here is some field trials with and without manure to get some cost versus benefit and understand it better. How to talk about carbon sequestration and how it happens. I think we talk about soil health, farm viability. This is diffusion of innovation, the classic paper on corn hybrids. There's a way that this stuff gets out there and people end up adopting it. And just the word climate smart agriculture and using that as a framework. And here, just finally on my last slide, here's what they call climate smart agriculture. One way to think about all this stuff. And there's these 4 quadrants. So I would say in your mind, take 5 dots and use those as a dot exercise to vote. Put the 5 dots wherever you want on these 4 quadrants that matter to you. What do you give a crap about, okay? Maybe your hair's on fire about greenhouse gas. We're all gonna burn and die and flood and so we should all worry about that. Or maybe it's about food security. I don't know what you care about, right? Think about that. And then what are the 5 that you think are the most effective ways to talk about it? And probably one of them is increasing economic resilience, or maybe people that care about the natural resources a lot. So there's got to get your head around this, I think, as a decent framework to talk about things. That's kind of how I've been thinking about it recently. Thank you.